Just real quick, obviously want to share some things about what we heard on the floor, and the nice part is I've been around here long enough to have a little history about all these conversations that went on today. A couple things. We're fully funding Medicaid. When I was in the minority and the Democrats controlled the legislature, we would underfund Medicaid to get around the expenditure limitation. We'd come back in and do supplementals to keep kicking the can down the road. The decision that we made here today is what responsible budgeting looks like. It's what responsible government looks like, that we have growing costs of Medicaid like every other state. We have a situation where we've had a lower tax than many other states, and the federal government made a decision that states like Iowa had to lock in their rate much lower. It looks like we have a window to collect additional revenue from the federal government, who I feel, in my opinion, we've always been underfunded for Medicaid for decades, for us to draw down some federal dollars and put us in a position where we can fully fund our Medicaid system for the current and the next fiscal year. Every state is facing these budget pressures. It just so happens Iowa had a lower tax rate and it got locked in by the federal government, and there's other states that are going to be drawing down much more federal dollars. That's why we made the decision we did today. And don't forget, we saw an amendment offered on the floor that I want to make sure everyone sees the difference in what you're going to get from Republicans and Democrats. As Republicans, we had to make a tough decision to lead today to make sure we fully fund Medicaid. The alternative is putting a 5-year freeze on the health insurance companies, which they will very clearly tell you will cause them to have to leave the state. So right now we were in a position where we had to make a tough decision, and we recognize that to fully fund Medicaid. The alternative was saying, you know what, we're going to drive health insurers out of the state, and then Iowans don't even have access to private insurance. I don't know why we would want to put ourselves in that position. As a state, we already see it increased cost. If we can't even access health insurance, that'd be devastating for Iowa. The other part of the bill that I don't think got enough discussion, because I think the Democrats, knowing they were going to vote against it, would be the fact that we just codified and put into law that we can afford to fund the tax cut on tips and overtime. The Taxpayer Relief Fund, which was created by Republicans and Democrats, mind you, I keep saying that, they must keep forgetting that they were a part of that when they created it, some of them that are still here, that we created that for tax relief. This was something unforeseen that came from the federal government when it comes to tax on tips and overtime and some other things. Thankfully, we have this Taxpayer Relief Fund to be able to absorb that. There's other states that are in a position where they may not be able to couple with the federal government and afford that same thing to their citizens. So this bill was a much bigger conversation than just attacking Republicans. Like I said, when the Democrats were in charge, they underfund Medicaid. We're trying to make sure we're fully funding it and stay ahead of this for the most vulnerable Iowans. So that's on that piece. Would love to talk about the property tax bill as well, but they just got me out of the chair a little bit fired up, if you haven't noticed, and so would love to talk about anything else.
Senator Clemish earlier told us that there might be a way to assist the HMOs. He seemed open to it. This seemed like a closed door.
I would say, from the standpoint, what we're trying to be very mindful of in any decisions that we made, our goal to get approval from CMS, because this obviously would have to be approved up the chain through the federal government. Whatever decisions we made as we moved forward in session, we just have to be very mindful that we would not close the door on those federal funds and not be able to draw them down. So any further discussion that would take place around this conversation, we would have to be very careful to not jeopardize a potential waiver or approval from the federal government in whatever we do.
A lot of the discussion centered around rates for Iowans and whether they will go up. Wellmark has said that this would cause an increase. Other companies seem like they're indicating the same. I mean, do you believe this will increase some Iowans' rates, and what do you say to those people?
Here's what I believe that I think all Iowans would agree on. So again, I find it entertaining the Democrats saying we're talking out of both sides of our mouths. We sat here in a position where, as we lowered these taxes, we continue to see rates going up. And now we're in a position where, when we're doing a one-time increase to draw down those federal funds and make sure we're funding Medicaid, we're hearing the same thing. So it looks like to me, the policies that we pass here in the legislature, they're going to keep driving up the costs on Iowans regardless of the decisions we made. Lower the tax, they go up. A one-time increase in the tax, I think that's the threat we're going to hear. And we don't have a problem with the health insurance companies being profitable and being successful in Iowa. That's why we rejected the Democrat amendment that would have made it leave the state. But we also understand that this is a big problem that we're facing as a state when it comes to Medicaid, like almost every other state. And this is a one-time fix that we see right now that addresses our current shortfalls we're having.
There was also some talk about, since it is one time, and what happens, kind of down the line if we keep seeing Medicaid deficits. What do your conversations look like to fill that in the years to come?
Well, I think we also heard on the floor that, why didn't you come to us for solutions? Well, here's what I would tell the Democrats. We've brought up solutions. We've looked at adding work requirements, for example, to our Medicaid expansion. which would help to try to bring down some of these costs and some of the usage of our programs. It looks like to me anytime we want to make these programs more efficient, they vote against those kinds of things. So I guess I don't know what their solution would be, but right now we're in a position when we're in charge. We've tried to make the programs more efficient. That's a perfect example of something we did last year on this program to try to get folks out in the workforce less dependent on these programs. And so, it's just very frustrating that everybody just keeps accusing us of things that I saw done when the Democrats were in charge for years.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to accuse. I was just saying, that the projection is for an increasing deficit.
And I think I probably got on a little bit of a tangent there, Stephen, so I should have answered your question, so thank you for following up. But I would just say from that standpoint, we recognize we're going to have these continued shortfalls. We'll have to make the decisions 1 year at a time to make sure we can fully fund them. All I can just say is our priority is making sure we are fully funding them so we're not having a reduction in service. So that is a problem for the next General Assembly to have to address. We recognize that shortfall, and I just remind Iowans, 1 in 5 Iowans are on Medicaid. It's projected to be a shortfall of $600 million. This conversation is not going away. That's why we've done some of the things that we've had when we've tried to make our programs more efficient and really make sure that they're there for the most vulnerable Iowans. Because if we're not proactive, it's going to be very hard for any state to stay ahead.
A point of order was called on Representative Zabner when he was describing how the reason for the Medicaid cuts is that the Iowa delegation in Congress voted for this. I didn't really understand the point of order, but do you acknowledge, why are we going to see these Medicaid cuts or the shortfall of $600 million? Do you acknowledge that it's related to the One Big Beautiful Bill passing last year?
So without getting, I'll try not to get too wonky on that one, Laura, but I think it's a very important part of the conversation. In the One Big Beautiful Bill, they set a new cap that Iowa was much below. A lot of states were milking the federal government, going much higher than that 3.5%, drawing down significant dollars of federal money, meaning the higher that tax was, the more money you'd get back to your state. In Iowa, we had been proactive in trying to be responsible by keeping our number lower, the number we talked about today of 0.95. So what you've seen happen in the federal government was probably what was best for their budget, but since we've been at a lower tax rate, we will be missing out on some dollars that other states would have had access to. And that's why we had to make the decision today to do this, to try to draw down that $124 million that we probably will miss out on the future. So was it best for the federal government? That's probably a better question for the other Grassley, but what I can tell you, that's why we're here today and having this conversation in Iowa.
But the shortfall you expect in Medicaid is related to the budget reconciliation bill.
Not necessarily. I would say that's not the case. I think we have to be very mindful of some of the language that was used here to fully blame it on the decisions from the federal government. Keep in mind, Iowa has always had lower reimbursement rates on many things than other states have when it comes to Medicaid. Every year we talk about increasing reimbursements rates for individual provider groups or looking at nursing homes. So we always talk about it. So we've always been, in my opinion, at a disadvantage in many other states. So we've kind of faced that uphill trajectory, and also when it's coming off of our federal COVID increased match funds that we were getting during COVID, there's just kind of a lot of a storm. And again, 1 in 5 Iowans, healthcare is becoming more expensive. We have more elderly in nursing homes right now, making up about half the population of those facilities. So just that conversation in general, I think, is happening in almost every other state.
Can you ask about the property tax bill?
Thank you. Give me to settle down a little bit, Aaron. Is that what you want to do?
No, I like you fired up.
Yeah.
Tell me if this is, correct me if this is an unfair classification, but it seems like House Republicans and the governor have sort of combined their proposals into the latest amendment version. And then looking forward, how do you now bridge the gap? And it seems there's still some very distinct and even ideological divides between yours and the Senate's proposal.
Well, I think, how does that look as we move forward? I don't know if I have a good answer to that question. And I wouldn't say that we worked out any sort of an agreement with the governor at this point in time. Here's what I would categorize this bill as. You look through it, it keeps a lot of the principles that we originally had, but we also try to include a few pieces from some of the other bills. I'll use a perfect example being like TIF reform. We didn't have that in our original bill. The governor did, and the Senate had sent us a bill last year on TIF that we didn't take any action on. So we felt that rolling that into this conversation meant two things that each of them have been asking us to engage in. One of the things from the governor's piece, looking at SAVE and making sure that that statewide penny was going more towards property tax relief. So I wouldn't say that we've made an agreement with anyone particularly, but I do think that this is a step in the right direction for us to be able to work towards providing certainty and relief, and hopefully we can get ourselves in a position, and I feel confident that we'll find a way to get something past this session.
Senator Clemish has kind of said the pilot program for community colleges to offer bachelor's degrees is like effectively dead in the Senate. I know they've not taken up several other higher education bills. Can you talk about the, just what your discussions have been like on that community college bill, and if you think there's still a way to get that done?
So I'll try to answer it this way. A lot of my plan is after we get through today, and then as we come into next week, find out what those bills are that made it through all the committees. And then, as you guys know, you've all been around here long enough to know, not every single bill is dead. Now, most of them will be obviously falling through the funnel. But if there's things that are priorities for the House, and I have not been able to identify what those will be at this point, but priorities for the House or priorities for the Senate, we can find ways to work through certain pieces of some of those pieces of language. To that one specifically, I've not had a conversation.
It doesn't appear that there's an appetite in the legislature to raise the tobacco tax. Is there an appetite to raise the tax on vapes, because it's merely the sales tax, and the states surrounding Iowa are taxing vapes and vaping products far higher than Iowa is?
I would say, and part of our conversation, we've talked about this as a caucus. What we did today obviously was a very difficult decision for us to make. We don't like to be in a position to have to raise any sort of tax. We felt since it was something that wasn't permanent, and we had to help get through that budget shortfall for Medicaid, we felt it was not unreasonable. Part of it is just with all the tax conversation floating around the building, whether it's in some of the other bills that you're seeing with the gas tax, looking at a tobacco tax, there's been bills out there, gaming taxes. We're just trying to, as Republicans, we're trying to be mindful that, that's not what the things we ran on. Those aren't typically the issues we like to pivot to. But that being said, there's a lot of session left. I don't know what it ends up looking like ultimately in our final negotiations, but where we are at this point, that's been kind of our thought process on where we are and why we haven't taken action at this point.
So this was it for House Republicans in terms of an yes?
I'm never going to say never to anything around here. But
You could.
I've been here long enough to know that that's not the case. What I can tell you is we're trying to be very mindful of what the impacts are going to be on each decision that we make, especially when they involve taxes.
This morning during the HHS committee, Representative Harris said House Republicans have no interest in codifying the managed care system for Medicaid. Can you talk about your discussions and what are the reasons that House Republicans are not interested in codifying the privatization?
Yep. I think one of the things that I would keep in mind in that conversation, if you look at some of the pieces of legislation that we've passed, making sure that anything that has significant increases to the state would have to be looked at through the legislature. And so I think there's other ways to go about this to make sure that we can assure that we're still going to have a system that has checks and balances in it and runs more efficiently than the way the old system would have. So I think it would be more along the lines of that there are other ways to get about making sure that the legislature would have involvement than just taking that blanket vote.
The Senate last night added their continuing, for lack of a better term, the continuing budget resolution to legislation to keep it alive over there. I'm wondering how you feel about that bill when it ultimately makes it back here and that provision specifically. And I put it this way to Senator Clemish this morning, because he said the goal is to avoid DC style politics and shut down. And I said you could argue, could you not, that continuing budget resolution, that federal policy enables that sort of behavior because they know they can walk away from the table and the government will still be funded, versus not having that here at the state forces lawmakers to the table. I'm curious your policy on that.
Yeah, and as far as tying it to emergency powers and things, that's two, kind of in my mind, two questions. Some of it's going to be is how important it is in the conversation with the Senate. I recognize that it seems to be something that's fairly important to the Senate leadership, so we recognize that in the House. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of a former appropriations chair and just what does that mean when it comes to putting a budget together. I don't think we're in a position to have fully vetted that within the caucus and what it would look like. Some of that's going to be how important it is to the Senate for us to consider that, and then we'll work through that when we get to that point. But I'm going to look at it from the standpoint of, regardless of what it looks like for shutdowns and the end of session, what does it look like as far as appropriators in this building, and how would that impact us? That's kind of the thought process I'm going into it if we get in a position where we're having that conversation.
Have you had discussions with your caucus about concerns that this could prevent discussions on eminent domain in the future in the Senate?
I'll be honest with you, we haven't had a full discussion as a caucus on it. I know members are aware of it in the Senate. I'm looking at it from the standpoint, I think there's a lot of things that you could say it could impact, and I think that's why we have to be very thoughtful of putting that into place. That doesn't mean it's not something we can discuss, but I think if we're going to do it, we have to look at what's the best for appropriators and putting a budget together in the state of Iowa, not necessarily what are some of those outside impacts that it might have.
Sounds like Senate Judiciary Committee moved forward your 3 strikes bill with an amendment, and they might be interested in making some further changes if they take it up. Curious to get your thoughts on that, and also I don't believe they did move the judicial, transparency language that you passed.
And like I said, for as far as every bill that they didn't pass and did not pass, we'll take a look at that over the next few days. But we're more than willing to work with them on finding some level of solution. I know that our chairs, there's been a lot of conversations between our chairs and their chairs on that bill and what the impacts would be on the 3 strikes. We still feel pretty strongly that we'd like to see some sort of enhanced penalties for career criminals in the state of Iowa. So that just would be one of those things we'll engage with the Senate on to see if there's a path forward or maybe a level of compromise we can have.
Is there a path forward for the medication abortion bill?
How I'll answer that question, obviously with the funnel and everything, I would just say there is a chance that we would have that conversation at some point during the rest of the session, but I don't know if we've made a final decision, but it is on the table as a potential continued conversation.
Were there elements of that bill that were problematic for Republicans?
In the one, the black market, the one that we've been calling it? Well, I think we've been just trying to work through it. When we came in this session and we met with, members of our caucus that are, our caucus is very pro-life, but members of our caucus felt that was an extreme priority for them. Also meeting with all the pro-life groups in the state, they recognize that that's something they'd like to see us move forward. At this point in time, we're just trying to work through what is the best pathway for that and what may that look like. That's why I've said I just don't think it's fair for me to say that that's not still something that's out there that could be discussed.
The governor's Veterans Services bill didn't make it through the Veterans Committee this week. How are House Republicans feeling about that bill?
That one, we're still making a decision whether that's something we may want to consider potentially in another committee. I think that, the original bill reduced money for some of the VSOs across the state, which was the initial reaction from our caucus was very concerning about that. I think there's been changes made to the bill that it would go in a different direction. We have members that are working on potentially if we were to move that to a different committee, what would that look like in a different way to do it? So I don't know if there's a final decision, but at this point, it may be something that continues through the Appropriations Committee.
Has any progress been made, talks on eminent domain pipelines?
So I would say as far as pipelines, my hope and expectation was we would get a bill over here from the Senate so we can kind of see where we each are at. At this point, it looks like we're kind of in a stalemate from that standpoint. What I would ultimately say is, as far as House Republicans' perspective, we still feel that the conversation's not done for this legislative session. So that's really what my most recent update would be from our perspective. It's something that we're going to want to continue to discuss as the session comes.
Do you have to pass the bill before you adjourn on that topic, or is there a
I never
universe in which-
I never say never on anything.
I heard that
But
somewhere.
maybe the last 10 years. But here's what I would say is we feel pretty strongly we need to have a further discussion than what we've already had this session.
Is it
So
to that?
I'm gonna do one more.
To that point, sorry to continue on the same subject, but is it frustrating not to get the bill back from the Senate? Like they haven't given you anything to work with. You've given them something.
We have passed multiple different opportunities out of the House over the last several years with the willingness to try to find a level of solution. We would love for there to be something that comes back to us for at least to work off of. But at the same time, just because a bill doesn't come back from the Senate, I don't think that we should also just throw up our hands and say, well, I guess the issue's dead for the year. So I think we're going to continue to look for pathways in which we can find some compromise. So.
Pesticide
Thanks.
immunity, House Judiciary didn't move it. Are we done talking about it, or is it possibly going to be moved somewhere else?
I haven't even had a chance to talk to Representative Holt. As you've seen, I had a busy day today. So I would have to, next week we'll have more conversation about some of these things when I get a little bit more certainty on everything where we are. So
Thank
thanks,
you.
guys.
Thank you.
I'm taking this with me. So